Welcome to the Two Cities podcast, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Theo Howard, and today it is the 12th of April, the Saturday of Passiontide. Today I am privileged to host Dr. Peter Chojnowski. Dr. Chojnowski, welcome to the Two Cities podcast.
Nice to be here. Thank you for interviewing me, and I look forward to our conversation.
Well, I've long admired Dr. Chojnowski's work. He is a teacher at Immaculate Conception Academy in Post Falls, Idaho. And Dr. Chojnowski has written 2 books and over 300 articles and reviews for a variety of publications, including the Distributist Review, the British Catholic Medical Journal, Catholic Family News, the Latin Mass Magazine, the Journal of Metaphysics, and the Fatima Crusader. He's also a prodigious lecturer. He's given numerous lectures, including one that's relevant to our discussion today, Hippie Spooks, How the CIA Made the 60s Cultural Revolution. And in November of 2017, Dr. Chojnowski established Sister Lucy Truth, which was incorporated in order to investigate the life and identity of Sister Lucy dos Santos of Fatima. And we might touch on Fatima actually today because I think that's relevant to our topic. So
Yes.
Dr. Chojnowski and I are going to be discussing Catholics and the Cold War. I'd like to explore several topics under this theme. How the Cold War functioned in a dialectical fashion. We're going to particularly look at the anti-communist side of the dialectic, which of course Catholics gravitated towards, and how functionally this served to assimilate many Catholics into liberalism. And I think we both discussed previously, this is an insightful, important case study for shaping the world that we're in today. And also to reflect on today's politics, which, as my friend Josu Hernandez points out or characterizes, is essentially shadow boxing within liberalism between left and right. We receive a simplistic narrative of the Cold War, polarized between a left-right perspective. And I think in the period, the 40 years roughly of the Cold War, you had a narrowing of thought and discourse about possible political systems, which was really to the detriment of Catholic political thought. My friend Miguel Casada points out that the red side would be nothing more than the last stage of the Great Revolution, a developed and coherent liberalism which came to annihilate the remnants of Christian civilization against which liberalism had been fighting in the preceding decades. End quote. Now, we rightly talk about Vatican II as the Church's surrender or concordat with the liberal order, but we should also consider the context of the Cold War for habilitating Catholics into that order and how they worked in tandem, where conservative and traditional Catholics might be critical of Vatican II, but they found themselves siding with American imperial power and therefore becoming recuperated into liberalism as a result. So, Dr. Chojnowski, with that introduction set, whereabouts would you like for us to begin?
Well, I couldn't agree more with what you said, and the older I get and the more I think about these issues, the more I think that the Catholics, not the Catholic Church, but Catholics, made a huge mistake all the way back into the beginning of the 20th century and even before, with the Leo the 13th rally to the Republic and in France, and then, the condemnation by of Pope Pius XI of Action Française, his basically betraying the Cristeros, and then, Pius XII's concordat with democracy and democratism. I think, and there's so much more. There's so much more that we can talk about. How basically the university system, Catholic university system in the United States became a recruiting ground for the CIA. How the Jesuit universities were working in tandem with the CIA. always with this idea that that was the only choice, that you had to join with the American liberal experiment. I hate that word because it's just, contingent fact of history that America is like it is. But, the experiment, you had to join with it or you were pro-communist. And if the church is the true church of Jesus Christ, if it's founded on the promises that Christ gave to St. Peter, then it has the truth of God and it has the grace of God. And the papacy and the local churches have the power of God behind them. And they should have used that spiritual power instead of relying on this diplomatic dance that they did throughout the 20th century and even into the 21st century, trying to accommodate to the revolutionary systems that were established in hatred of Christendom, in hatred of the Catholic Church. And our accommodationism has left us where we are, which is basically people that no one listens to, and we don't play a significant, we don't have a significant role on the world stage as Catholics as such. And, we're sucked into one group or another, whether it's the Trump people or the neoconservatives, or I don't know, even the left-wing Marxist liberation theologians. We're sucked into various groups, but we have no stance of our own. And Catholic social teaching should develop that stance. And it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy that, the regimes and the ideologies that were produced after World War I, in trying to save some remnant of Christian civilization, all right, that they were ground under with the National Socialist regime in Germany. And basically, we became a tool of the United States and the CIA. And the more you see that, and I think, as we'll probably discuss, I went to Christendom College for 4 years to get my 2 bachelor's degrees from there. And I think they're very much part of that whole CIA effort, along with, I think so many Catholics that are known as traditionalists or known as right-wing figures are actually, purveyors of the Americanist ideology, and in some way, closely or at a distance, work for the CIA and CIA intentions and agendas. I mean, there's so many examples that I'm sure we'll get into it, but
and of course the climate of fear and paranoia stoked by the regime at the beginning of the Cold War,
yes,
created an environment whereby, now 17 intelligence agencies, grossly unconstitutional, were legitimized, and their power was rapidly extended. This doctrine of national security was developed to cloak criminality, and the machinations of deep politics.
The president was given complete power, as we see now. We see all those now pictures of Trump signing all these imperial decrees. Just they never passed by Congress, never reviewed by a court, basically, and just the imperial decrees. And we wonder, what is this so-called checks and balance system that James Madison was so proud of? It doesn't exist. If it ever did exist, it certainly was blown away by the American security state that developed during World War II and after World War II.
It doesn't exist, and the Fourth Amendment, the right to be free from seizure and searches, doesn't exist with mass surveillance. The CIA's gross violation of Article 1, Clause 7 of the Constitution for Congress having oversight of the appropriation of monies by the executive or by other branches of government since 1947, not a single audit, estimated at billions and billions. And the more one looks into contemporary deep political events, something like the Dutroux affair, Epstein currently, what one encounters is intelligence agency activity. And that really puts a barrier to any kind of public scrutiny of what's going on. And you realize that the intelligence agencies today almost work in a Masonic way, that they are the secret societies for the sort of revolutionary aristocracy of our time, to be a member of the intelligence agencies. And it's important to remember that this is all because of the Cold War, really. I mean, following the Second
Right.
World War, but this is
And
where
they work in tandem with Masonic organizations, actually, as you see, for example, with Operation Gladio and the P2 Lodge, which was created by the CIA. Licio Gelli was, a CIA creation. OSS initially, worked with the SS in Germany and Italy, and then was basically, the U.S. government's man on the scene in Italy for decade after decade in his P2 Lodge, and which basically more or less controlled the Italian government. So, I mean, there's real Masonic activity behind the CIA, besides the fact that, its recruiting ground is Skull and Bones and so many other elite schools that, are connected to, these old American families. And so, no, it's all interwoven. It's all interwoven together. And, that's the problem, my country and yours. That's one of the problems, is that when they spread masonry. And, the reconquest of Italy in 1943 from Mussolini's fascists, basically, as they moved from one city to another, conquering from Sicily up through Calabria, they installed one Masonic lodge after another to return masonry to Italy, with the help of the mafia in Sicily. So they didn't really, that's the governing ideology. I think that's what we have to remember, and that Catholics were so okay with that is something shocking, and something that we should do penance for, because it's really a betrayal of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Amen. Yeah. And an institution like Propaganda Due Lodge reveals the fundamentally false nature of the dialectic, because in that lodge you had senior members of the Italian communist or socialist parties, as well as leading industrialists, the Agnelli family, Berlusconi, the heads of the military intelligence services. So that's what got lost with the dichotomy of communism and then the anti-communist crusade that Catholics aligned with.
Right.
The truth that Pius XI taught and reminded us that we should not forget that the father of socialism was liberalism. That liberalism
Yes.
created the
Sure.
vacuum about the good that society should be orientated towards, set up a conflict between liberal capitalism and the proletariat, and fed this monster of socialism which came along. But we can see many instances of their collaboration. John Lane points out that Wall Street financed the Bolsheviks, General Electric electrified Moscow, and Ford built them the world's largest truck factory. The same powers played decisive roles in engineering World War II, by which Soviet communism and their investments were saved, and communist rule extended to half of what was still at the time mostly Catholic Europe.
Right.
The fruits of it were the suppression of Catholic civilization.
Absolutely. And just think of the betrayal of Poland, which was supposedly the purpose for initiating World War II. to save Poland from the German invasion. And then the fruit of it is handing the Poles over to the communist regime, and which shows some things that work beyond the obvious. And yeah, that it's amazing just that when you look at the development of the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, which was the forerunner of the CIA. I mean, they began to develop this. I mean, from 1945, they started developing what would become the CIA, and immediately after putting down the sword in World War II, they got ready. They picked up the sword for World War III, getting ready for World War III, and you know, that was, and so many people who were anti-liberal and anti-communist at the same time played a shocking and even murderous role in that whole Operation Gladio, always justifying it as being, we're fighting the communists, and without, you know, other than keeping the communists at bay. All right, they never did invade, but they ended up taking over intellectually. Marxism, secularism, ended up taking over, and you know, the anti-Christian culture took over intellectually and culturally, and ironically enough, that intellectual takeover was sponsored by and created by, to some degree, the CIA, the anti-communist force. You know, I've spoken recently about, you know, Herbert Marcuse and his fathering of the New Left, you know, the CIA sponsor of, you know, the abstract art movement and so many other cultural things that moved the country and our civilization to the left, and realize the goals of the left. And I think as I reflect on it, and there's much more to reflect on, I think the CIA used the right for for its anti-communist, anti-Soviet purpose, really, but also to neutralize the right,
Yeah.
and to make it one with the Americanist agenda. And I'm an American, I always have been, but I don't agree with the Americanist agenda. That's an ideology. That's something different than just being an American. And but basically, all the right, you know, people who were right thinking, or at least seemed to be right thinking, they were assimilated into this Americanist agenda and neutralized. I think that happened, you know, with National Review and the, you know, the conservative movement that opened up in the 50s with Russell Kirk. I think that happened with Triumph magazine, and you might not you might not know of the what I now think of probably was an infiltration of the Carlist movement in Spain in the late 60s and early 70s by some of these characters associated with Triumph magazine and later Christendom College. I think that was U.S. intelligence infiltration, you know, turning the traditionalist Carlist movement the way that, you know, the U.S. government wanted it to turn. And no, I think it was a manipulation of the right in order to transform it. But the CIA's real agenda was leftism. And that's my judgment now. I mean, there's nothing written in stone here, but just reflecting on it and how they've intervened and what's happened since. And the fact that, you know, traditionalism and the counter-revolution has been basically, I mean, the engine has been taken out, and, you know, the spark plugs have been taken out, and it's dead. You know, in some way it's dead, and I don't want that to be the case. I hope that's not the case in the future, but that's what's happened. and we've allowed it to happen.
Yeah, it is necessary to have that distance from events, so that perspective, as you say,
Right.
historia magistra vitae, that you can look at what the fruits are and were since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of communism,
Sure.
and how the 90s really provided the excuse for the liberal regimes in the West to just throw off any pretense of Christianity and natural morality at all. And there's been a rapid secularization ever since. I
And
think
look at the fruits of the anti-communism of and the fall of, quote unquote, fall of communism, the political party, the rule of the political party. I mean, when I went to Prague in 2004 and spoke to the people there, they had all lived under the communist regime and even been imprisoned by the communists. And they said they suffered so much, but they held their faith. For example, in Czechoslovakia at the time, if you signed your child up to learn the catechism, they said you could be sure that that child would never have any significant place at a university or never get a significant occupation, a higher level occupation. You could be sure of it if you signed them up for catechism. And you know what they did? They signed them up for catechism nonetheless. And now you have this incredible secularism that has come into Europe and taken over Central and Eastern Europe, and it's just a shame. But we were pushing. I mean, there's consequences to liberalism. There's consequences to the Americanized left that we were pushing for so many years, and there's consequences. There's consequences to the Masonic ideology. It destroyed Christendom in World War I. It obliterated any of the anti-communist sort of restorationist movements that were building after World War I. And then, we signed on to Americanist secularism after the Cold War. So, I mean, there's just a huge problem, and it's just sort of sad that we could never, articulate a coherent ideology or a coherent worldview, or just put forward Catholic social teachings to, circulate and to really play a role in the public sphere. Instead, we always have this inferiority complex, it seems, in the face of these grand pagan ideologies.
Yeah, and there were many strategically placed figures and agents like William F. Buckley and Warren Carroll to raise the alarm about communism and, as you say, discourage Catholics from presenting Catholic social teaching, which has all the answers. Miguel Casada, my friend, writes very well about the problems, the error of anti-communism, in that it rests on an incorrect definition and attribution to negation. As Aristotle points out, negation is not definition. The affirmative vagueness is frequently exploited by non-communist ideological forms. Thus, in the name of anti-communism, revolutionary conceptions such as liberalism or fascism end up being justified. The fallacy of understanding that the negation of Marxism constitutes a political affirmation leads, as we see, to the exact opposites, since politics ends up dissolved in a magma of opinions as ideological and revolutionary as Marxism, whose nexus is the negation of the latter. It could be objected that traditionalism fell into this error in the 1936 Crusade, and although personal errors would not be grounds for discrediting the ideology, such an objection is misguided. Traditionalism rose up against Marxism as an exclusive evil. Raphael Gambra reminded us that the Carlists fiercely fought red totalitarianism, yes, but insofar as they saw it correctly as a reformulation of the quintessential revolutionary ideology that had shattered the old order. That is liberalism. The Carlists in this way were anti-communist insofar as they were anti-liberal beforehand, due to the denial that liberalism implied and implies of the order of things. Not so, for example, were the conservative liberals, frightened by the consistency with which the Soviets had applied their same premises, or the phalangists who fought Marxism not for being socialist but for being internationalist. End quote.
Yeah, absolutely. I think. Well, what would you say based on that analysis?
Well, I think prior to the Second World War, there was a vitality to Catholic action, which meant that something like the 1936 Crusade, as problem the consequences were maybe problematic, but something as Catholic as that Crusade, as saving Catholic Spain, could still cohere, given the clear understanding that Catholic social principles are opposed to both communism and liberalism. But
Sure.
with the intervening event of the Second World War, and as you pointed out earlier, Dr. Chojnowski, Pius XII's misguided alliance with democracy, and not just democracy, I mean, pressuring the Archbishop of Cincinnati to preach in favor of the alliance with the Soviet Union during the Second World War. And then during the Second World War, saying such things as democracy seems to be a postulate of human reason. This close collaboration with liberal democracy then, I think, predisposed the church towards this fatal embrace with
Yes.
Western liberalism in the post Second World War period, so that by the 1960s, with the betrayal essentially of the higher clergy at the Vatican II,
Right.
especially of Christian civilization, then you can no longer expect something like the 1936
No.
crusade afterwards.
No. And they subverted Franco's regime.
Yeah,
They subverted, and it all came from it came from Vatican II to some degree, but otherwise it came from America. Let's just be honest,
yeah,
okay? Let's just be honest. They subverted the Franco regime in many ways. One was Paul VI, Dignitatis Humanae, which undermined and rejected the idea of a Catholic state. And then you have, of course, Opus Dei, which I don't know. It seems to me that Francisco Franco looked at the externals of Opus Dei and was pleased and bought into and accepted them into his government, not realizing that they hated his regime ultimately and wanted to bring his regime into the liberal world, first economically and then finally politically when he died. So, the Opus Dei's infiltration of the Franco cabinet. And then you have what I think is infiltration of the, Franco Spain in the early 70s, where you have the attempt by, say, Warren Carroll and this whole group that met in El Escorial in Spain, under the guise of Catholic civilization. I can't remember the exact name, Christian Civilization Institute or something. I can't, in light of Warren Carroll's early ties to the CIA, in light of other individuals' ties to the CIA who ended up going to Christendom College as professors, I cannot but believe that the CIA was already involved in, extreme right-wing conservatism in Spain, trying to manipulate it, trying to direct it away from basically this idea of a self-sufficient economy, anti-capitalist and anti-socialist ideology. And They were trying to subvert it from within and turn it into an American friendly worldview and ideology. And that happened. There were those meetings in Spain in the early 1970s, which ended up producing Triumph magazine and then finally Christendom College. But the dynamism, the evolution of that movement was towards Americanism, towards neo-modernism, towards accepting and embracing of liberal capitalism, which is what happens now. And so they hijacked one of the remaining regimes that stood up against both liberalism and communism. But this was due to the CIA's infiltration and influence, I'm convinced.
Yeah,
I mean, how do you have Bill Casey, who was director of the CIA during the time I was at Christendom from 1981 to 19, well, started in 1983, but he was director of the CIA from 1981 to 1987 under Ronald Reagan, and he's a very close friend of Christendom College. In their library, they have a Bill Casey room dedicated to him because he was so supportive. He might have been on the board of directors. I thought he was. He could be, but he might as well have been, even if he wasn't. So he was tight with them. And how can you be tight with someone like Bill Casey, who, started in OSS, then went to the CIA and became director of the CIA, and was involved in the whole Iran-Contra activities and under Reagan, and which he admitted apparently on his deathbed. And how can that just be by chance that you have all these former CIA professors and the actual director of the CIA as one of your big sponsors, and you have nothing to do with the whole thing? I don't believe it.
no,
I don't believe
it's not by chance. I mean, David Wenport
No.
exposed in his book Time, Life, CIA, and Courtney Murray in the American Proposition how the Jesuit involvement in the subversion of the obligation of civil society, civil authorities to recognize true religion with Dignitatis Humanae, being led by Father John Courtney Murray with his contacts in the CIA, the reward that was given to the Jesuits for that was that Georgetown became a feeder school for Langley. And
Yes.
my friend Dr. Jesse Russell has talked about how the right, the post Second World War, Cold War right, has almost functioned like a holding pen for the revolution, where they are contained and corralled and neutered, as you point out.
Yes.
And there are so many elements to this, because you look at someone like Father Peyton and his family Rosary Crusade, which had support from the CIA, and he was touring South America, and you could see how they were seeding trust among Catholics by sponsoring efforts like that. But there's a price that needs to be paid, and
Yes.
that's the bill that's come due. Casada points out that the short anti-communism is mortgaged with Manichaean schemes originating from the American universe that reduce reality to freedom or Marxism. The grotesque nature of this strategy, which emerged from American foreign policy years ago, and which the Spanish right wing, since General Franco, adopted without any discernment, deserves no refutation. Another very good example of this dichotomy, this dialectic working to destroy Catholic order, was in Portugal with the Carnation Revolution. So Salazar died in 1967, feeling very betrayed by the Vatican and the subversion of Dignitatis Humanae, the way that India invaded Portuguese Goa, one of the most Catholic cities in all of Asia, and Paul VI then went to go and visit India a few years later, saying nothing about this illegal invasion of this island of Christendom in Asia. And then he was replaced by Marcelo Caetano, who was overthrown in 1974-75 with the Carnation Revolution. And this is another instance of this pincer movement of communism and Americanist liberalism. Kissinger said that he was, who was Secretary of State at the time, feared a Catholic order surviving, as well as apparently a socialist government, and so sponsored the Socialist Party, which is backed by the US, the CIA, and others who relentlessly pursued the themes of power to the people, democracy, freedom of speech, the usual liberal epithet. But worse than that, they promoted pornography and the debasement of Catholic Portuguese society. Lisbon went from one of the safest cities in Europe to one of the most dangerous in the space of a few years. Very interesting article called Revolutionary Blue from Time magazine, which says, quote, blessed with a rightist government and a conservative Roman Catholic hierarchy, Portugal before the April Revolution was one of the least libidinous countries in Europe. Striptease shows, topless dancers, dirty books, and X-rated movies were, legally at least, not allowed into the country. At the most, an occasional street vendor would risk arrest by the Morals Squad and peddle a few bootlegged copies of Playboy or some other forbidden girly import. The Morals Squad still exist, but since the April Revolution, the risk has gone out of eroticism. In fact, one of the curious consequences of the coup that ousted the old regime is Europe's biggest explosion of pornography since Denmark legalized practically everything. The outburst of porn has made strange bedfellows of Roman Catholic bishops, the Communist Party, the Actors Union, and even some impresarios, all of whom are pondering the age-old question of how to have liberty without license. Debauchery is a pig's breakfast, one anguished citizen wrote the Lisbon Weekly Espresso. There have even been charges that the CIA is sponsoring the new pornography to sap the revolution of its energies. Sexually explicit Danish magazines are now available on newspaper kiosks along with tamer publications like Penthouse. Uncut versions of previously forbidden films such as Last Tango in Paris and A Clockwork Orange are drawing huge crowds. A dubbed-in Portuguese version of Deep Throat has been approved for import. One reason is that military junta and the leftist unions, which heavily restrict the theoretically unfettered press by refusing to publish anything not to their liking, can use the sex explosion as evidence that censorship does not exist. Another is that people obviously like it, says one kiosk operator in Lisbon's Restauradores Square. A few passers-by sometimes mutter, but we are making a lot of money from erotic magazines, end quote. So a Catholic society like Portugal attacked from the left with this socialist revolution and the promotion of immorality, and then also from the right with the American intelligence agency's promotion of degeneracy and
right.
a new open society.
There's a interesting, I don't know, it just, this whole question pops up in so many different areas. For example, like the whole abortion issue, and I'll tell you something that I know that I've never said before publicly, but the gentleman who was a dear friend has since died, and but the whole question of abortion in the United States, you know, the whole question of Roe versus Wade, and yes, I'm forgetting the justice of the Supreme Court. He was a very much of a conservative, quote unquote, Italian name. I'm just forgetting from appointed by Ronald Reagan. Just slipping
Anthony Scalia.
Scalia, yes, Antonin Scalia, and his position, and this was told to me about 1990. His position was that we should overturn Roe versus Wade because it should be the whole question of abortion, you know, within the American context, should be put out in the popular sphere and be subject to democratic voting. Like whether if a state wants to have abortion, it should have it. But if a state then doesn't want to have abortion, wants to restrict it, it should be restricted. And Talking about Christendom College, because I know a lot of these people very well, and but I think you know Dr. Damien Federica, who was president of Christendom College and was a professor of mine and a dear friend. We had our differences, of course, and however, he told me that he was fired as president of Christendom College because of an article he had written criticizing this Scalia's position of setting it before the democratic process. He said, Dr. Federica said, this is not a matter for the democratic process. This is a matter of morality and justice. He would always emphasize the justice aspect of it. He was very much pro-life, and he was fired for that because the board of directors at Christendom didn't want criticism of conservative justices to come out and by their president directed against an opinion of these justices. So it's a serious thing, but he was fired. he was fired and replaced, and by Tim O'Donnell, who just left not that long ago. He was in for a very long time, who sort of towed the line in so many ways. But yeah, he told me that personally. We were alone, and he told me that, and it just expresses to you when we capitulate to the Americanist idea. Again, not America. It's not America. It's the Americanist idea. And it's not even the American people who probably, they don't have, well, they're forced to accept this ideology, but a lot of them don't even think about it. So, but the Americanist idea of democracy and liberalism, and we'll just argue things out in the public sphere and truth will emerge, surely. This is a serious consequences, but it shows who's winning. Mm-hmm. The side that is winning are those that are in favor of assimilation to this Americanist liberalism, and those who object, even in this way, with regard to the unborn and why it's wrong and what should be the legal stance, the moral stance, the political stance of the pro-life movement. That shows you how we're just being overwhelmed, and we have been overwhelmed and crushed, and we haven't fought back. I mean, sometimes I talk to my friends, like, where's the counter-revolutionary movement? Where is it? Yeah. I hope it's still there with these embers, but like, where's the real counter-revolutionary movement that stands for Christ the King, that stands for the natural law because it's true, not because it agrees with Article 4, Section 5 of the Constitution? So it's had real world consequences, and those who step outside that given parameters that liberalism has set up, even within traditionalist context, you better be ready to be sidelined and marginalized. And we have. We have been, but we fight on because God gives us the means.
Time was when that rock solid traditional Catholic Antonin Scalia would be denied communion for such a
sure stuff. Absolutely.
And it just shows how polluted Catholic political thought has become with this marination, as you say, in American liberalism for so long. And I quite agree. What's so dispiriting is not so much the defeat, although of course that is very abject, but it's the manner of the defeat, as you say, the ignominy, how it's so tawdry, so pathetic that there isn't a fight back, that it's supine, and there is very little that echoes the heroism of the Vendée counter-revolution or the Cristeros or the Carlists in the Spanish Civil War. There's been such a degradation of the Catholic fighting spirit.
And we've forgotten the principles. Like what are we based on? We're based on metaphysical principles concerning God's proper relationship to the world. We're based on Christ's statement in the Gospels that said, all power in heaven and on earth has been given to me. We're based on all those social encyclicals and anti-modernist and revolutionary encyclicals of the 1800s and 1900s. Those are our principles.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to, and there was men who tried to, and see, the thing is, those are our principles, and there were efforts to apply these principles in modern times, in modern situations. Like I think of Heinrich Pesch and his Solidarism, trying to say, no, the moral order does apply to the economic order for these reasons, because because the economic order is a human order, and man is controlled by the moral law and ordered by the moral law. So the moral law has to be reflected in the economic order. And, that was just sort of plowed under by this, universal hatred of Hitler and anything that could be dubbed Nazi. And it was all plowed under. And so we're left with a world after World War II of liberalism versus communism. And we're on the losing end of both those sides. So, no, I mean, it's to regain principles, to talk about them, to install them in people's minds is our task.
Yes. Yes, and that's something that I think, we can take up anew today and put our shoulders to the wheel to try and promote, because, as you say, this dichotomy, that's one of the legacies of the Cold War, this dichotomy in economics between socialism and economic liberalism, economic naturalism, free market dogmatism. I was having a discussion the other day, I mentioned earlier, about IKEA and how just recognizing the destruction of communities and small producers from large corporations like this, the homogenization of the interior decoration of all homes across the world, the destruction of local culture and diversity, the fact that they are, they have planned obsolescence. It breaks in the back of your car. If I had the skills to produce freestanding furniture myself, I would build it to endure, to pass on to my son. But the gross waste involved, the reduction of choice, these are all features of the system, not bugs, as John Lane said. And we get reduced to this dichotomy where, okay, well, if you're against that, the alternative is gulags and mass famine.
Good.
And that's just a legacy of the Cold War, and is ignorant, as you say, of Christianitatis Maior, the great Christendom of the Middle Ages, but also the enduring islands of Christian civilization even into the 20th century, which present alternatives, real alternatives.
I mean, you should have seen the pushback that we got in the 1990s when we were publishing so many articles on distributism and solidarism in the Angelus magazine, for example, of the SSPX. How many people just were vicious in their attacks, because if it's not capitalism, it's communism. And that's what it is. No, that's the argument, because we're stuck in this Cold War mentality. We're still running along those tracks. And maybe, I don't know, the next generation can get off those tracks into a proper way of looking at things. But unfortunately, even up until recently, we're still running along the same tracks. And we really need to sit down and rethink, because if we remain on these tracks, We're going to have the progressive destruction, the disappearance of our religion, and the forgetting of any kind of any memory of that old order that we supposedly uphold, namely Christendom. We're forgetting about it.
Mm.
I'm a teacher of still, and to try to bring back even whispers of that order is difficult because it doesn't resonate anywhere. It's Fox News versus CNN.
Mm.
That's the war. Well, CNN's sort of been neutralized, but it's MSNBC. It's MSNBC versus Fox News. You either fit into one or you fit into the other, and that's the current dichotomy in the United States, and it doesn't get us anywhere. It doesn't get us closer to the truth as articulated by the church or Christian civilization.
Yeah, I'm finding that as well, actually, that the evocation of Christian civilization is getting harder and harder to transmit to younger minds. And this is something John Senior wrote about quite a lot with the sort of diseased imagination of modernity and our estrangement from creation and nature. But yes, my late friend Don Luis Infante spoke about this actually, that what we're facing here is a minimum coherence for Christianity. It's that serious now that if there isn't some kind of reaction soon, that the kind of minimum coherence for even a Christian social order within family homes
Right.
is under threat.
Yeah.
So it is dire.
I think we're even facing a dehumanization, and we're finding that people on the so-called right are, engaged in this dehumanization of others that I find troublesome.
Yeah.
And even people, say immigrants, and not that you endorse. See, again, this is the alternative. Either you endorse open borders, or you got to put them in railway cars and ship them out of the country in these inhuman conditions. These are human beings, and we have to remember they have a claim on our wills and in our reactions. We owe them something. We may not owe them residence in our country, and we can legally process them one way or another, but they're human beings,
Mm-hmm.
and they're not necessarily criminal. And are we even losing our humanity? Is the right even losing its humanity? Because that would be not only our religion, not only our received civilization, but even our basic humanity. How do we treat people and look at people? And do we still love? Do we still love? And, I find it troublesome because I find that even that basic charity and basic, human feeling is being mocked or rejected and put aside, and that's wrong. That's not the church. That's not the Christian mind. There's got to be a way of even applying basic moral sense and humanity to these situations that we find ourselves in.
Yes, and as you say, the whole question is miscast as well within the framing of liberalism and the denial of nations, of ethnicity
Right.
as realities willed by God. So that today, and I've been writing about this recently, immigration criticism has become the premier right-wing theme across
Right.
Western politics.
Well, one thing I'll just throw in this, we're always complaining on the right, so-called right of our southern border. Well, who destroyed South America in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
It's the United States furthering of Freemasonry and the Freemasonic regimes.
Yeah.
They aborted the whole Spanish effort to bring all those people up to a cultured Catholic civilization. And instead, they were taken over by these occult forces. that didn't mind impoverishing the people and, ripping away their most basic Catholic sense. So we have to realize that too. Like there's a history here that we have to remember and consider. And I want to say that publicly because it's true. It's true. I mean, when the Habsburgs tried to send Maximilian over to Mexico to try to establish some order, in a country that had fallen into perpetual chaos, he was brought down. Maximilian was brought down by guerrillas, Benito Juarez, which was financed by the United States. And Mexico, I mean, has it ever recovered? Has it ever recovered? And so we have to have some kind of educated, humane, thoughtful approach to all these things. But I'll just say Fox News is not giving us that approach. And I'll say it here. I mean it.
Well, God is a vengeful God who visits his wrath onto the third and fourth generation, and these sins of our past. And Britain is very prominent in visiting those on the world. They will redound to our societies today. And I wrote about how the immigration theme is misplaced, not because it is per se wrong, but because it effeminately locates the problem in the other and discourages Western man's examination of his own sins and apostasy, thus putting off the necessary repentance.
Well, I think these right-wing, so-called right-wing nationalist groups, like the Dutch one comes to mind, or even the German, they're upholding a Europe of the Enlightenment, liberal Enlightenment. From what I can discern, they mean by European values the values of the liberal Enlightenment of the 1700s. They don't mean Christendom.
Yeah, Marine Le Pen and the National Rally voted for the enshrining of the right to murdering babies in the French Constitution.
Yes.
Yeah, and then you've got Catholics now who are getting all distressed at Marine Le Pen getting prosecuted apparently by the European Union. I mean, as if she's some kind of champion of Christendom. It
had nothing to do with nothing to do with the traditional French right at all.
Yeah,
it's sort of a center. I mean, maybe that's how far the Europeans have gone, that they think this is some kind of extreme right-wing movement, but they're just center left. No, excuse me, center right at most. Centrist or center right at most. They don't represent the French right. They don't represent Charles Maurras and Action Française and the traditionalist movement of the past.
Right.
And so, I mean, that's a perfect example. Who's behind them? Now Trump's coming out as a big supporter of Le Pen, but that's not the right. That's not the right at all. And it's an embrace of the revolution. It's an embrace of the Masonic Republic. This is the right. Well, that means the right doesn't exist in any significant way in France, and that's sad.
I don't think it does, and it gets even more pathetic because the current rallying cry is "Mega, make Europe great again," as if Europe, in its own, let's say, right-wing traditions, doesn't have anything else to draw upon other than to appropriate these American slogans, that everything has to be recast in an Americanist frame within the empire.
Right.
It's just so tawdry. But it comes from the Cold War, because with America's conquest of half of Europe, you had the American approval and reestablishment of the major parties in Europe. So the old Catholic Center Party in Germany became a party of Christian democracy. It became sort of ecumenized, and they controlled the left and right. And I think you alluded to this earlier. The Cultural Cold War by Frances Stoner Saunders talked about where she discusses the Congress for Cultural Freedom, run by CIA agent Michael Josselson from 1950 to 1967, which had offices in 35 countries, held art exhibitions, published over 20 prestigious magazines. And its mission was to nudge the intelligentsia of Western Europe away from its lingering fascination with Marxism, maybe, towards a view more accommodating of the American way. This consortium the CIA built up, consisting of what Henry Kissinger described as, quote, an aristocracy dedicated to the service of this nation on behalf of principles beyond partisanship, basically liberalism, was the hidden weapon in America's Cold War struggle. She says, behind the unexamined nostalgia for the golden days of American intelligence lay a much more devastating truth. The same people read Dante and went to Yale and were educated in civic virtue, recruited Nazis, manipulated the outcome of democratic elections, gave LSD to unwitting subjects, opened the mail of thousands of American citizens, overthrew governments, supported dictatorships, plotted assassinations, and engineered the Bay of Pigs disaster. In the name of what? Asked one critic. Not civic virtue, but empire.
Exactly. That's the more and more I look at it, the more and more I draw that conclusion. But it's an empire with leftist principles,
Yeah.
also, that manipulates the right, and has a lot of blood on its hands, needless blood, like this strategy of tension in Italy and in Europe during the 60s and 70s. These bombings that were, they used these neo-fascists to engage in these bombings just to direct hatred towards the communists and make sure that everyone, didn't vote communist the next time they voted. And but innocence, as they admit, as now they come forward and admit, these men, many innocent women, children were killed just to stoke the tension so that people would go to the state for security and would be open to, increasing state security, and, which basically meant, U.S. domination and more totalitarian control over our lives. So, this is the fruit. I mean, it doesn't seem much like liberty in the true human sense of the term. It seems like complete statism, to tell you the truth, but with wrapped in the red, white, and blue flag of the United States. So that's what it seems to me to be.
Yeah, liberty to slave away for Google or Apple,
Right, exactly.
the new order.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, you see there that the American intelligence agencies effectively exercised control and influence over the European right wing and used, as you say, these secret armies, these neo-fascist groups, while simultaneously co-opting left-wing parties and redirecting their focus away from criticism of the capitalist economic order towards sexual liberation, sexual sin, and sort of defanging them as potential opponents of the hegemonic capitalist system.
Yes.
And it's just converging on the same order. And this is what Don Alvaro Dawes pointed out, that the Cold War ended with a kind of trading of cards between the US and the Soviet Union, in which the Americans assumed economic and cultural hegemony, but it was based on a certain human recognition of Marxist ideology. And this collusion was exported by international organizations, all of the NGO networks under Washington's leadership, to the leading to the total hegemony of liberalism. Miguel Quesada writes, which has been radicalized by some socializing elements, with examples such as contemporary social democracy. Thus, anti-communists today rail against the coming cultural Marxism, identifying behaviors born of the most grotesque Americanism, as Thomas Molnar once denounced. Ghosts today, such as the culture wars, disguise the reality of things and provide oxygen to anti-communists in their skirmishes against a straw man designed to reinforce hegemonic liberalism. A paradox as curious as it is coherent, Marxism, nominally born to put an end to liberalism, with the bourgeois interpretation of the latter, has turned the Soviet red beast into the attack dog of the international plutocracy. And the anti-communists in the past fighting poorly, today are not fighting at all.
Yeah. Yeah, they when I went to Eastern Europe in 2004, they, were sort of recently within the last 15 years out of, communist domination in certain sense. And they said basically the old right, the old opposition was eliminated. The real opposition was eliminated after the war. And the opposition that grew up later, like with in Czechoslovakia and even Poland with Solidarity, was sort of a compromised opposition with KGB and, even fostered by the KGB. And also, they basically said the communist rulers just changed hats. Easily changed hats from we're Marxist to Marxist Leninists, and now we're Democratic. We're Democrats, and we put on our Democratic hat, and we get elected again. And so that's how they viewed things. They viewed the situation as the real right, the real opposition and counter-revolutionary forces were destroyed after the war. And I think that was the case in France also. In Western Europe, they were destroyed after the war with the, so-called resistance. And that's a whole other story, but that's something interesting that has to be uncovered because we're not allowed to think about it. We're not allowed to investigate that, but we should, because it's a history in itself, and we can just realize, like, who were these men? What did they stand for? What did they hope for? And maybe inject some of that hope into the future, because their principles were correct and their hopes were good, and hopefully those ideas can be revived again.
I think that's the key thing, is to really, as you say, elevate and emphasize, promote Catholic social doctrine and its principles, to explain why you would have elites in Poland who were members of the nomenklatura very easily transition into becoming capitalist elites. Well, Catholic social doctrine can explain that, because they're both materialist ideologies that deny the natural law, the first precept of the natural law, the existence of a creator God, the immortality of the soul. But there's so much subterfuge that to really examine, to really understand, with at least the publicly available information that there is, which is limited, something like the Cold War is difficult. I mean, to take two examples, you mentioned France there. Some people have made the case that the 1968 Événement in Paris, the May 68 revolution, which is part of a whole wave of sort of youth leftist revolutions across the world, that was orchestrated by the CIA, or at least promoted by the CIA, in order to sort of fire a shot across the bows of Charles de Gaulle, who actually fled to an airbase in West Germany during the rising, to kind of warn him against being too taking, let's say, too different a course from the American empire. But if you go back to the Algerian War, one of the points made I think by Monsignor Henri de la Suze in his book Freemasonry, The Roots of Christophobia, Arnold de la Suze, was that a lot of these conflicts are just sort of feuds within the lodge. That there are, like in France, there are streams of Freemasonry for every political party, and that in the Algerian War, one of the Freemasonic lodge was aligned with the OAS, which was itself aligned with kind of Vichyist elements, and actually quite a few traditional Catholics at least sympathized with those groups, and the Franco regime as well. There was kind of that traditional right, but it had Masonic elements there, and then they were fighting the kind of Gaullist Masonic lodges. There's this whole like layers of conflict beneath as well.
Yeah, and we haven't even a lot of people know about it. I don't understand much about it, but there's these lodges until recently, or these Masonic oriented groups in France, that unite, for example, Jean-Marie Le Pen with certain traditionalist prelates that would, identified as traditionalists. And so there's things, as Americans, it's difficult for us to understand how this could be the case, that, they're aligned with Freemasonry, but that's how it works. And, the P2 Lodge was right wing, totally American sponsored, working for the American government. And so it's a matter of how do we have to try to understand this in order to understand our history. The more and more I get along, I think, like, we're so immersed in our narrative that we've been given a narrative, and it takes so much to think outside that narrative because it's been shoved down our throats since we were children. So, but the truth is, I think, outside that narrative.
Yeah.
And it's probably a lot stranger than we think. But, we should try to understand it because the mind is made for truth. And also it would make sense of our lives. Even looking back in my whole experience of Christendom College and all these other organizations I was involved with to some degree, just to look back and try to put them in context, what was really going on. And I think it's important, but I think it's important for everyone to rethink that whole history and, like, what was really happening. Forget the narrative, get outside the narrative, because that was fashioned to lead us astray, to divert our attention from what was really going on. And, the problem is most traditionalists, most Catholics are still very much within the narrative. And, they may hook onto one conspiracy, which may actually be a, conspiracy fact. As you and I know, there such a things exist. But, how does it fit into the broader picture of things? That's the question. So, yeah, to escape the narrative, that's very difficult, and it takes much thought and reading, but I think it's worthwhile.
Yeah. It is, and it as you say, in one sense, it's very difficult today because, as Dr. Jesse Russell pointed out, today the sort of primary battle is in the information sphere, and modern media is psychological warfare. That is its structural purpose. In the same way as he pointed out, the newspaper and the radio in the age of the nation state, whether you read a liberal newspaper or a conservative newspaper or a socialist newspaper, they all buttressed the nation state and consolidated loyalty to the nation state. So today, that is the structural purpose, to destabilize us and to sow false narratives psychologically. And I remember Michael Matt saying that in the 1980s, it was the work of Catholic traditionalists was so difficult because you had this anti-communist Pope John Paul II, you had Margaret Thatcher in Downing Street, you had Ronald Reagan in the White House. It was very difficult to get people to see outside that dialectic. But now I think there's so much water under the bridge, things have deteriorated that much more. People can be more open to seeing it. But when you look at something like, you mentioned Solidarity earlier, held up as a great sort of Catholic success story of the Cold War, and Lech Walesa was a KGB agent, and yet
I know.
Solidarity was being funded by the Vatican. John Paul, or the CIA was funding Solidarity through the Vatican. You had Radio Free Europe. So what is going on here? That you've got this anti-communist organization which is honeycombed with KGB informants, and then being sponsored by Western liberal American intelligence agencies. It's just it's
Yeah,
bizarre.
I remember at Christendom College there was all these Solidarność, bumper stickers all over the place, and it was the rage in the '80s. And you know what also was the rage in the '80s was the Mujahideen, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. We actually went to a conference when I was in Christendom. We went to a conference in which Warren Carroll spoke, and the purpose was to praise and to lionize basically the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the Islamic warriors who were fighting the Soviets and in this noble cause. And well, then look what happens, 2001, and the whole narrative switches. But yeah, they were pushing these Islamic guerrillas as they were pushing solidarity. But again, it's all within the narrative that the CIA is giving us, and that's no. When you look back, you see so much, and we're told that there were nuclear weapons that probably stationed in like Nicaragua and directed against the United States. And we went to actually the executive office building in Washington to have a conference on this. And so I mean, they were really using Christendom, that whole Heritage Foundation, and just manipulating. And Bill Casey, again, that central figure. It's amazingly connected to unravel that. And but I'm surprised more people don't come forward and talk about this and try to lay out the truth and the matter, and sort of repent, if you will, from their former associations, or trying to rethink everything. Very few do. Very, very few people come forward. I mean, you see these people in Operation Gladio, coming forward and say, yes, we bombed this station, we bombed that station, we blamed the communists and the Red Brigades, and we did that, and now we admit it, and it was us, and for this reason. But here and within tradition and conservative Catholicism, you hear nothing. Never mind, from the left wing Vatican now, why don't they repent of something that they did? Some collusion that they had in the past with CIA, KGB. There's no repentance. There's no coming forward. Not even, they don't even come forward with the mafia connections that worked their way into the White House, the Vatican, thanks to the post-war period and revival of the mafia in Italy. I mean, where's there some truth? Where's there some repentance? Where's there some re-examination? Needs to be done, and I'm surprised more people aren't doing it.
Yes, I mean, it just shows again how compromised so many power holders must be, probably as a result of intelligence agency compromat collection. But yeah, as you say, you don't even get kind of modernists or leftists condemn international finance capital and usury and major corporations, monopolies, and so on. It's just utter full spectrum dominance by the enemies of the church.
Absolutely. And I mean, it could be they're afraid. It could very well be that they're afraid. I mean, look what happened to Bill Casey. I think there's even a movie about this, or relating to this somehow. But Bill Casey, right before he was to testify before Congress on his role in the whole Iran Contra situation. He had a stroke. He had strokes, and he ended up dying soon after, right before he was to testify. So in these strange situations, but maybe they're afraid. They could be afraid because they may have compromised themselves so much, and the beast could be a lot more vicious than we even realize. But there's some reason why it's so difficult to get anything out about this period of time, about what really happened to the church in our civilization during that whole Cold War period.
I think Triumph magazine was a really interesting moment in American Catholic history where there seemed to be a very illumined group of Catholic intellectuals who really did try to popularize and discuss true Catholic principles of the social order for a period of time. And I'm sure you know the book From Conservative to Catholic by Brent Bozell.
Right.
And the Triumph magazine editorials really did. I mean, with the Roe versus Wade, they said essentially that the Catholic Church must declare war on the American
Yeah.
political
Yeah. Yeah.
regime.
Yeah.
There was like now an undying enmity.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so I really quite impressive. But then, as you
They
say,
closed down
it
soon
closed
after.
down,
Yeah.
and somehow, I mean, with the accession of John Paul II, Reagan, that zeal just got extinguished somehow.
Yeah. That deal. Well, yeah. I want to talk about. I mentioned Triumph, but in the 80s, we thought things were being restored. That's what the impression we had. And that's, everything like traditional education, the great literature of the West, the church, Christian ideals, the liturgy. We thought things were being restored, but they weren't, not at all. In fact, it was just accelerating the decline and the decomposition. But that was the impression, it was sort of this neoconservative moment. But, because I went to Christendom because of advertisements in National Review. And, they were sort of, in some way working together. But, and Christendom College, of course, was produced by Triumph Magazine. That was the forerunner of Christendom College. But I think Triumph got to the right place. But again, I think they were infiltrated by the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at the list of contributors recently for this interview, I said, there's quite a bit of CIA infiltration in this whole thing. And, even someone you just reconsider all these things. Like someone I very much admire, and Eric von Kunat-Ledeen, who was very close to Christendom, and, I saw lecture a number of times. And, how did he get to the United States and be allowed to operate? And, how was he so prevalent everywhere, traveling around? And, he was a great monarchist, but he sort of fell within the CIA narrative in a way, tragically enough. And he ended up going from this distributist idea to outright libertarianism. Mm-hmm. And were all his lectures sort of backed by CIA influence groups? Mm. I don't know. And there's there's so many individuals like that. I don't know. I think they probably were, even though he said like massive amounts of intelligent, good things and true things. Somehow, I think his ideas were being used because they were not fruitful. Ultimately, they didn't produce the world that he wanted. But
I think that's the key thing. Yeah.
yeah, they were when because I took up his books as soon as I got to Christendom, but in his articles in National Review. But his ideas were ultimately rejected, and I think that's one of the reasons was because he assumed that Americans, or let's just say Americans with influence, would side with him, and maybe he didn't realize the predominance of this fundamentally leftist ideology that motivates the whole American system. And he didn't take that into account, perhaps, or didn't realize how strong that was. And that ultimately the ideas that he put forward were going to be sidelined and, rendered sort of peculiar, in the American or Western mind for most people. But I think, I think he was writing under the auspices of the OSS, even in World War II. That's my judgment. I don't know, but that's what I think was the case. And sorry, I'm getting. Are you still there?
Yes, I am. Yep.
Sorry, my computer. But there's so many, and he was on the board of Triumph magazine, as was Warren Carroll, and the wife of Brent Bozell, who was the sister of William F. Buckley, and I think even Triumph magazine was infiltrated, and but they were saying good things and things that I've been trying to put forward my whole life, and so it in a way it was tragic. But I could see why they died out. They didn't have any air to breathe within the American system, especially the system. Well, ever it hasn't changed much at all, but certainly in the 70s and still Cold War mentalities. So they had no air to breathe. That what they were saying about Christendom and the rights of the church, and that Christ has rights and God has rights, that didn't fit in at all with the agenda of the Americanists. And so they just ran out of oxygen, and it's tragic. That's exactly the mentality and the ideas that needed to be put forward, but tragically it died out, and you just had the continuation of National Review, which was this mishmash that ended up just becoming a neocon publication, in my mind anyways.
Yeah, I think part of the genius of the American empire is the way that it is so adept at rehabilitating would-be threats back into itself so that they function to actually reinforce the fundamental liberal Masonic premises of that empire.
Sure.
So I think
Yes.
someone, as you say, like von Kuhnelt-Leddihn, or Masonic intelligence agency sponsorship, if that was the case, or with
That was
other figures, often I think these things can be as you know, they're not entirely obvious, that people know where those red lines are, where the regime will not permit you to take part in public discourse if you were to start talking about, bank creation and the money supply, which is something that all Austrian economists just presume, whereas
right.
it's the fundamental source of so many economic ills, that you won't get an endowed chair at Hillsdale if you start talking about that. And so it's almost that they don't need to control individually these figures, that these figures self-censor, that they
Yes.
know where the bread is buttered, and
Yeah.
where those red lines are for the regime. So
Well, I'll just give you two examples of that. Um, Leydin never criticized the American Revolution,
mhm,
or really focused on how it was. I mean, touched on it, but how the French Revolution was pretty much impossible without the American Revolution,
yeah,
and all the ideas that it seeded, and how even yeah, it displaced more people, the American Revolution, than the French Revolution did, and that was totally forgotten. So, and even traditionalism, the traditionalism in the United States, but by that I mean traditionalist Catholicism, was based on. It started out as culturally speaking, demographically speaking, it was based on the John Birch Society and
mhm,
John Birch Society members. They're the ones who picked up on traditional Catholicism, and they're Americanist and liberal to the core.
mhm,
So the foundations were compromised,
mhm.
and there was this strange unwillingness to get to the root of the matter. Like, what were the American Enlightenment followers? What about them? How did they? How do we judge them ultimately, according to a Catholic perspective? Do we care that basically they took up arms because they were so outraged by the Quebec Act in 1774, which legalized the Catholic religion in Canada? Do we ever think about that? Like, maybe assess it?
Mhm.
We don't have to deny the fact that we're Americans to reassess our history
Right.
and sort of put ourselves in perspective. But that's another example of these supposedly traditional movements being built on fundamentally liberal and even revolutionary ground. So
Yeah, well, we have a similar dynamic here in Britain where any traditionalist movement, let's say, is looks to Edmund Burke as its sort of founding father, and these are movements which Catholics become involved with. And Edmund Burke sung the praises of the Glorious Revolution, or the inglorious usurpation that English right wing thought never comes to terms with, or very rarely comes to terms with,
yeah,
the English original sin of modernity, the apostasy from the true faith, the embrace of
sure.
Protestantism, these fundamental errors which they ensure failure, they ensure futility
Absolutely.
eventually.
And well, I mean, for example, Russell Kirk, he was my absolute hero when I was in high school, with a conservative mind and all that. He was a venerator of Edmund Burke, and he was fundamentally a Whig in his, ideology, and even wrote a book, a book about David Hume, who I can't stand. I think he's one of the most revolting characters in the history of philosophy. A totally insane presentation of reality, and yet David Hume is portrayed as a conservative, and which is absolutely screwball if you actually know what David Hume taught. So yeah, I mean, that's like Russell Kirk. I went to his house. I met him in the early '90s, and I stayed at his house, and I met his wife, and went to his lectures, and he's pushing a Whig that basically rejected the traditional order, and this was the ultra right foundation of American conservatism. Another thing to be rethought.
Mhm.
It's another thing to be rethought, and and then Russell Kirk never left us an agenda, just sort of beautiful words and picturesque images and ideas, but nothing concrete for the future, and no vision really. And so, fundamentally unsatisfying ultimately. And I, just moved away from him. But again, this is American conservatism.
Mm.
And what influence the CIA had on that, I don't know. But, he was certainly the founder of modern American conservatism, no doubt.
Just to go back to something you mentioned earlier, Dr. Chojnowski, about the sort of false promise of the 1980s, this sort of feeling of counter-revolution that was in the air at the time. And I remember Dr. Alan Phimister saying that this was a recurrent phenomenon throughout the 20th century, actually, that with a revolutionary period, you had a sort of period of consolidation afterwards, which seemed like it might be reversed. So the 1920s was actually quite revolutionary, the Jazz Age. Some people call it the first sexual revolution. And the 1930s, by contrast, after the Depression, was quite conservative. And you have quite a lot of good legislation passed, and many countries becoming, let's say, more Catholic in their political order. Then with the 60s and the 70s being so revolutionary, as you say, the 80s was this period where people rested on their laurels. And I'm actually concerned that something's going on with that right now, that the 2020s, with people getting sort of triumphalist about woke being put away, that this sort of Trump,
Yeah, let's just say
moment,
Trump. Yeah,
yeah,
let's be honest.
and there
Yeah.
are these signs that like the worst of the trans madness has kind of been pushed back. But I think, if we just observe this pattern, then it's just going to continue. That actually
Yeah.
the forces of revolution are just, biding their time, consolidating their strength, and there's going to be another stride forward for them.
It's a lie. It's a lie, and it's a manipulation, and all these things culturally get worse under Republicans. It seems. Well, it's moved forward. The leftist, progressivist, so-called revolutions move forward under Republicans, like Richard Nixon, for example. Abortion was legalized throughout the United States under Richard Nixon. Divorce became, like in the early 70s when he came in, I only knew one, whispered, this couple's getting divorced. And it was like some kind of hidden thing that was meant to be hidden. And then, by the time mid 70s, everyone's getting divorced and it becomes common. During the 80s, you have the explosion of the homosexual revolution, the acceptance of that through the AIDS epidemic. And that was during Ronald Reagan's time. And now I think we're probably going to do the same thing. We have the seeming death, and I'll just say it because I'm not certain, but seeming almost the death of the pro-life movement. Since the beginning of, like, over the past year, I haven't heard anything about the pro-life movement. Not really. I don't see any, states, conservatives are almost afraid to approach it because it's not part of the agenda. There's no talk, and there hasn't been since it was legalized by the Supreme Court throughout the United States. There's no talk about overturning same-sex, quote-unquote, marriage. There's no talk about that here. It's nope. That's a given. That's given. And so is in vitro fertilization, and so is the abortion pill, and so is abortion for any state that wants it.
Yeah,
that's a given now.
Yeah,
and that's
higher numbers than before.
That's under a conservative regime, Republican regime. So no, I don't see anyone stepping on the brake, to tell you the truth. Yeah, I think that it was used, like especially the trans craziness was used during the campaign because the Democrats can't do anything other than bang the same drum of this wacko cultural revolution and the pro-abortion drum. That's all they did pretty much, and during the campaign. And but another example of the straw man. The opposition is just crazy woke, pro-trans, and but basically we dropped the issue. We dropped the issue of normal family life, and the pro-life cause, and being against these artificial means of creating human life. We just dropped that. Our focus is on trade wars, or I don't know. It changes every day, so I'm not sure what's it going to be tomorrow. But yeah, the social issues and the pro-life issues are pretty much dead here, as far as I can tell. At least nobody's talking about them.
When you have some of the most prominent Catholic traditionalists going to Mar-a-Lago as part of this new organization with a particularly tautological and nonsensical name, Catholics for Catholics, Bishop Strickland, Taylor Marshall, Father Altman, these characters, it's setting up again. I mean, it's just continuing this collaboration with empire, this uncritical stance towards the American establishment, and as you say, the gains of the revolution just get consolidated year by year.
Absolutely. And so, during these terms, of Republicans administrations.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Chojnowski, it's been a fascinating discussion, and very much like to speak again in the future, perhaps a Catholic approach to economics. So as we conclude here, any final thoughts to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think that our job is to think and read and, form study groups and discussion groups among people of good intention, and try to think outside the narrative. If I can put it in a broad kind of way, think outside of the historical narrative that's been fed us for all these decades. And because all truth is God's truth. And we want to know what really happened to his world, and who are what is the real nature of these characters who have dominated our lives and our parents' lives and our grandparents' lives, and try to put it all in a Catholic perspective, in a real perspective. So try to get outside the narrative and rethink some of these things. And maybe we can lay the groundwork for a future restoration, which will be real and not just seeming.
Yeah, amen to that. And as you say, to avoid the illusions of a false restoration, I think, speaking as an Englishman to an American, looking outside the Anglo-Saxon world can be fruitful for Catholics as well.
Sure.
That so many errors have been internalized in the Anglophone world,
right?
And starting with the magisterium of the Church and the Catholics' long fight against the revolution, and the hope of the establishment of all things in Christ, founded on his kingship, which is institutionalized as his reign over the community of men. So return to tradition in the full sense of that. Well, Dr. Chojnowski, thank you very much, and Viva Cristo Rey.
Viva Cristo Rey. Thank you.
For those that are interested in supporting my channel and in accessing premium content, please consider joining my locals page via the link that you will find in the description below.